The best results seem to come from specific inputs.
Is an individual that's able to perform considerably more repetitions than average on a repetitions to failure test at 70% of their 1RM. So if I can do 20 reps, am I a high volume guy? Or if I can do 5 reps, am I a low volume guy? The exact number that equates to higher volumes is going to be different than somebody in the exact same, his twin, let's take his twin, but he has an office job, no kids, and commits his entire life to training.
Gets his work done by noon.
Exactly.
Marcus asks, what were your biggest learnings in the last few months? But it's early January. Let's just turn that into the biggest learnings in 2024.
Yeah, there's so many different directions we could take this one, and I'm going to struggle probably talking through this entire thing, so you might need to tap me out here a couple times. But I think the biggest one for me was just the topic of my PhD ultimately, and we'll do a proper full debrief podcast on this. I am currently in the stages of finally writing up the full version of my dissertation project for preprint and ultimately publication. But ultimately, I came into my PhD with a mindset of very much on the side of, hey, for my coaching experience, my own training experience, there do seem to be magic bullets in terms of the training prescription that's going to optimize things for people. And I very much
What do you mean by that?
I very much thought of that from kind of like the physiology aspect of things. So like, whether that be your fiber type makeup, what do
you mean by magic bullets, though? I think that's important to
there's
make
a
sure it's clear.
Training prescription that is essentially the right fit for you. That is fundamentally different than the right fit for me, and fundamentally different from the right fit from somebody else. And there aren't necessarily commonalities that can explain that outside of unique physiological factors that we may or may not be able to measure. So, said another way, you could arrive at there are no principles that would allow you to arrive on that necessarily outside of that's what they respond well to. Or magic bullet sounds like a negative connotation. That's not what I mean, but it's more so there's just a unique combination of training variables that there is no clear systematic principle across individuals that would lead you to that conclusion.
It's specific formula that is just that unique to the individual.
Yeah. And
your thinking with your project is, how can we get insight into explaining those things
and identifying them
and identifying them. So I guess
if possible, identifying them if possible.
So your thinking with your main PhD project was, okay, I have this experience in coaching. This is kind of how I think about training in that.
And I'm misunderstanding of the data, but I thought I had very strong evidence for that as well.
So you kind of thought of it from an outcome-oriented perspective in the sense that, okay, I see that the best results seem to come from specific inputs in my coaching experience. So therefore, obviously something has to explain them, but I don't really know what explains them. So I want to, A, identify this unique individual response variation, and B, see if we can't find some explanatory, find a way to explain why this occurs in some people and not others. So basic example might be training status, right? So if you have protocol A versus protocol B, let's say I respond better to protocol A, you respond better to protocol B. Why is that the case? Maybe it's because you've been training for 50% longer than I have. Yeah. Is that pretty accurate?
Yeah, I think another easy example is like the actual question that we tried to answer in the study was high versus low volumes. And some hypotheses that people have had is like, is an individual that's able to perform considerably more repetitions than average on a repetitions to failure test at 70% of their 1RM. So if I can do 20 reps, am I a high volume guy? Or if I can do 5 reps, am I a low volume guy? Those kind of things. And so we tested a bunch of those, and that's essentially the general concept is, okay, is there, first and foremost, can we confirm that people genuinely, you're a high volume guy and I'm a low volume guy? Is that a correct assumption?
That's step one.
Yeah, it's step one.
If something is going to explain different outcomes, you need to confirm that they're actually different outcomes.
Exactly. And then the second step would be, okay, if that is the case, is there any diagnostic factors that are hopefully available to coaches that could identify the fact beforehand that you are a low volume guy.
Such as the reps to failure
Exactly.
test. Yep.
Exactly. So that is how I came into my PhD, very much with the understanding that, like, hey, this is a foregone conclusion. I'm just, let's
Proving it.
Yeah, let's add some more color to this. And then that began the long, laborious road of understanding this at a much different level than I came into understanding, with an awesome committee that pushed me to just understand this in a completely different way and hopefully more accurately at this point. But long story short of it, and again, this is going to require a whole episode with visuals and things to kind of talk through it. But I just fundamentally don't think that the variability that we are able to quantify between training interventions for a given individual, so for me, high volume versus low volume, I don't think that variability seems to be so massive that it needs to be a fundamental training consideration. Mm-hmm. And at face value, people may be like, that's ridiculous. Like, I know somebody that has, anecdotes, personal experience, et cetera. And again, I have all those too, that my coaching experience doesn't go away, or at least the way that I viewed it. I think about it very differently now, but I think many of those anecdotes are probably driven by environmental factors, I think is a big one. Like, where were you at in your life when you tried a given training style? Those kind of things that you cannot separate from your ability as a human. This is why research is useful, to all the different biases that we fall prey to. I think that's part of it. But I think that also can have very real constraints on the training that you're able to benefit from. And that's where the most important part comes in, of interfacing these systematic principles that are pretty much the same in the sense that that's how physiology operates across individuals, that even within that can arrive at different practical solutions, but you're not playing by completely different rules. I think that's really what it comes down to, is that for the most part, at least to the degree that it's practically implementable and practically actionable on, I think the training principles operate essentially systematically across people. The thing that may arrive you at a slightly different conclusion, and maybe even a widely different conclusion in certain really extreme cases, is going to be predominantly the environmental factors and obviously the subjective preferences, things like that. What do you have buy-in for, et cetera, those kind of things. And the only thing that falls outside of that, I think, would be biomechanic associated things. And just a very basic example of why I think that is the case is just thinking about exercise selection in a research study. Even if you are controlling the exercise in theory based on somebody's segment lengths, you really aren't. So like just a squat, for example, like depending on the limb lengths of an individual, the muscular demands that are going to be associated with that movement could be extremely different. Mm-hmm. And that theoretically could have contributions to the way that the outcomes look, because only certain things are measured in research, all these kind of things that I think biomechanics and like limb lengths and things like that, and the influence that has on your training program that we're going to talk about here in a second is exercise selection. I think that's a separate class where I do think some individual like variability really could be a big deal. Just as a basic example, like a bench press for you may not be a good movement for pec hypertrophy due to the way that interfaces on your body, and ultimately doesn't allow the forces to be placed in the place that we want it to be, stuff like that. So I think about this mostly from like the training variables perspective, but that's ultimately completely shifted the way that I've viewed training, in the sense that I'm not searching for this magic formula or magic secret sauce of combination of training variables that I think is going to unleash a completely new wave of progress for an individual. I think fundamentally we're dealing with the basic training principles that physiology kind of aligns with. We try to identify those. We try to make tweaks into somebody's training program that matches their environmental constraints and also their preferences and things like that. That could lead to different practical solutions for individuals that looks, from an outward-facing perspective, that things are very different. But at the heart of it, it's not a completely different process that you're playing by different rules, again, is the phrase I come back to.
So go back to where you were when you were thinking about this question, basically operating with the experience of like, hey, it seems when I adjust someone's program and I get everything clicking, that's when things really take off. So like you might, the kind of the way that I see this in my mind, or the way that I think about this, is like, it's almost like a heat map of like, okay, when I had SSB squats in my secondary days, my squat just always goes up and I always hit a PR at the end of the block, right? Or whenever I do most of my volume work in the 3 to 5 rep range, man, things just really take off on my deadlift, for example. Or these sorts of like associations that you see. And I think going into your PhD, basically the thinking is, okay, those things are like real observations, if you will, right? So like that's my experience. Therefore, I want to try to explain that experience. Whereas now you're saying, hey, there are issues with even saying that the 3 to 5 training block, the volume work with sets of 3 to 5, like if you were to actually just repeat that, there's like, is that actually repeatable? And that's ultimately the data you collected and you know, kind of questions that experience before. So how do you think about those experiences before? Because they were still experiences of like, hey, people seem to respond differently to different things. There has to be an explanation for why that's the case. How do you think about it now?
Yeah, I think it really does. In the example of strength, I think it really does come down to, first and foremost, what is the problem you're trying to solve? And I think that for the differences that we see between people, I think that's biomechanically driven. So the reason a training program may seem to work or not work, and those may be very different programs that you're looking at, it may not be even trying to address the same problem. I think it's the first point. So like just as a basic example, based on the way somebody squats, a different muscle group may be the quote unquote limiting factor. And so if a training program more strongly addresses that than another one, that's going to appear to be uniquely, it's the rep ranges, it's all these different things, when in reality it might just be addressing the actual biomechanical limiting factor.
But to me, that's like, I'm not saying I disagree. I tend to agree, but I guess how can you have confidence in that? You know what I mean?
I don't necessarily.
You're just saying that's the most likely explanation.
That's a story that I can tell myself after having gone through this process and basically not trusting any of my experiences with any sort of true confidence anymore, because of the fact, like if you really want to strip things all the way back and open yourself up to every single confounding factor of any of your observations as a coach, that's a very scary world. That is true. Second order effects, the environmental factors that you can't control. You can't test the counterfactual. There's so many different things as a coach that you're never going to be able to identify your experiences in an event where all of those are controlled in any sort of ethical format, where you're not putting somebody in an award where every single thing is controlled, right? And even then you have time-bound second-order effects that you may or may not be able to control for either, unless you're doing some sort of unilateral training, which in it of itself has limitations. So point being, to get this conversation even off the ground, you need to be able to trust your observations. And I don't think you can. Like that's step one, is that without some sort of systematic procedure, i.e. research, where we're trying to eliminate these confounders as much as possible, I think it becomes really, really challenging to identify signal from noise in any given applied scenario. So that's where you're starting from. And I genuinely have a very hard time trusting any of my intuition as a coach. And so like that's where you start from. So I'm fully willing to bite that bullet and accept that. If we put that aside and say, all right, let me try my best. What is the identifiable factor? I think for strength, which is slightly different in the sense that I do think the biomechanics of the lift or the problem you're trying to solve, that's the foundational component, because that can be slightly different between people.
It seems almost like indisputable in a way.
Exactly. So like that's the part of it, but the reason that's relevant is because then all the other training variables, I think, can have multiple solutions that end up addressing that problem, and it's not necessarily one of those magic solutions that's going to push it. It's not the fives necessarily. It's that this combination of volume, intensity, frequency, et cetera, are solving that problem. That's systematic across people. And then the variables that are going to more likely address those problems are also principles of physiology that, on average, or even probably in most applied scenarios, if you can recover from it, more volume is going to lead to more muscle growth, all those kind of things that we tend to know. I don't think those are different between people necessarily. It's just that the applied solution that you reach based on the environmental constraints that you're operating within, your recovery, your sleep, your occupation, your mental stress and ability to cope with that, might be a different applied solution, but it's not like it's operating on some completely different playing ground. And again, this is a very, very esoteric conversation that's hard to even explain without visuals, so I'm not going to belabor this too much. Yeah. But the point being, the practical part of it, I guess, is that fundamentally training prescriptions aren't going to look all that much different because there are still these
All that
environments
much different from what?
from how I thought about it previously.
Yeah.
That part of it
it's a
doesn't,
similar process still.
to some degree, but it's, for me, the reason that you end on those different solutions for different people is
Individualization. Like, you're not disputing individualization.
no, but the reason you're arriving on those solutions for me is almost entirely due to environmental and preference driven reasons, rather than for this person, low volume is better.
What's an example of an environmental reason leading to a specific,
Somebody's
a tangible individualization
so
change?
higher volumes are better for hypertrophy. Let's take that as the principle, right? But this person is a manual labor job. They sleep very poorly because they just had 2 newborns, and they are
Twins.
twins, and they're just a high stress person in general. For them, the exact number that equates to higher volumes is going to be different than somebody in the exact same, his twin. Let's take his twin, but he has an office job, no kids, and commits his entire life to training.
Gets his work done by noon.
Exactly. Yeah. If the manual labor guy was able to go and switch lives with that guy for a couple, let's say a year, I believe he would benefit from moving his training in the direction of what we believe to be effective. He's not a low volume guy. Mm-hmm. He just happens to not be able to manifest training prescriptions that would allow him to theoretically benefit the most, in my opinion. That's kind of how I think about it. And so the training that I would give him as a coach is probably going to be lower volume, lower frequency, lower time investment for a lot of those reasons. And that's going to look like, oh, this is a completely different kind of manifest. And even exercise selection, I'm going to try to select time efficient exercise, machines, selectrolyzer machines if I can, like supersets, all this kind of stuff. Whereas this other guy, if he wants to train for 4 hours a day because that's all he cares about, and he really wants to have things set up in a certain way, highly specific training, super high volumes, all those kind of things, it could look like you're operating on completely different principles to arrive at those solutions, but in reality it's not.
Yeah.
It's driven by these other factors that I'm not necessarily searching for. Okay, what are the laws of physiology that this person operates on that's fundamentally different than this other person? Mm-hmm. And so that's really what it comes down to.
And that's obviously an extreme example, but you could think of a lot of like nitty gritty things that lead to these more specific adjustments.
Yeah.
So instead of saying, oh man, every single time SSB is in my program, my competition squat goes up like crazy. What you're saying is there's probably a principle underlying that. Well, I guess the first question is like, all right, you got to probably view the fact that SSB was in there as permissive to progress as opposed to saying that just because we had 3 blocks with SSB in there and your squat went up, that doesn't mean there's something like elusive and can only be applied to an SSB squat. Now, maybe SSB squat, for whatever reason, is the only tool that can get the job done.
That's the part of it that I think, from a functional perspective, that I would change my mind on, is that coming into my PhD, I would very much view that like that exercise rep, proximity to failure, volume combination as like kind of sacrosanct, and I don't want to touch this because I might mess things up. I have no issues changing that now because I don't think it works like that. Yeah. I think there are...
I remember trying to be like overly specific when I would like try to say like, okay, this was the best block.
Yeah,
we're going to run that.
We're going to
run
it exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And like literally like double checking. I didn't change anything,
exactly.
right? Like
I don't think it works like that really at all anymore. It's ultimately that is accomplishing something, and there's probably 10 different ways to accomplish that. And I think that part of it is why.
So that's why I said it was
permissive
anecdotes. Because it was a solution to fit within their constraints.
Yeah,
their constraints being not getting hurt.
Yep.
Their constraints being sufficient stimulus for what drives the outcome of interest, which is informed by principles we gain from research.
This is probably the most succinct way to put it. Coming into my PhD, I would have said there is a far smaller number of solutions that would allow you to progress at an optimal rate. Now, I think that is extremely wide. As you get more advanced, that becomes narrower and narrower because the just the optionality that you have to kind of meet the fitness fatigue dynamics to make progress, I think decreases. But I still think even at that level, it's considerably wider because I think about it on a principles-based perspective.
So it's not a unique combination that I need to treat as like, this is the formula. It is, this combination worked.
Yes.
There are principles underlying why this combination worked, and there are probably multiple ways to accomplish that. And that's a lot. That's a much different way of looking at it, and it kind of seems obvious in
I was
in
gonna say
hindsight.
it's so hard to even.
But I do think there is a very strong crowd of folks that, including us,
100%.
Like
literally not long ago from
Yeah.
before my PhD, like I was emphatic in that proclamation.
Yeah.
Like I was extremely emphatic in the sense that if somebody there's a very small band of programs that is going to allow somebody to progress at an optimal rate, and my job as a coach is to identify that small band of programs and ultimately keep searching for that and find that small band. Now, I fundamentally think about it completely differently in the sense that, coming back to my favorite analogy, the Price is Right analogy, if I'm trying to hit $1 on the nose or as close to it as possible, there's a lot of different ways I could arrange my coins to hit that dollar and theoretically progress at an optimal rate. Whereas where I used to think the problem was I need to hit $1, but I also need to use the exact same organization of coins to do so in the future to progress at an optimal rate. And I think fundamentally, I think that simplifies the training process so much because you're not petrified from changing something that is leading to success. Now, obviously, you want to know, okay, what things are, maybe the largest contributors here, and that's where those big rocks and training principles help us a lot. But yeah, I do think it's really hard for people to like tangibly understand why that's such a big shift. But for me, that's absolutely fundamentally changed the way that I view training.
Yeah.
And as a coach, again, completely fundamentally changes things.